1, 2, 1, 2. All right, thank you all for coming out. It really means a lot to the club and to just the name of being a proud member of democracy. It means a lot to us that we get to have open discourse as such. And it is with my honor that I am able to present Mr. Michael Knowles, best-selling author of Reasons to Vote Democrat, which consists of 200 empty blank pages. I would also like to take this time to thank the young Democrats for coming up and wanting to engage in discourse. Can we get a round of applause for the Democrats? And for the Model UN kids, please remain silent until asked to ask a question. Thank you. Thank you very much. Don't overpower us. Come on. All right. So everyone, if we can fill up the front rows, that'd be fantastic. It is with my honor and respect to present to you Michael J. Knowles.
Thank you very much. I think I've got the lavaliers. That's okay. Thanks.
There will be a Q&A session after the speech.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out. It is really nice to see all of you. Just to begin, I have to apologize if I sound a little congested or stuffed up. You might have heard the president told his supporters that we would get sick and tired of winning. This has The downside is that has literally happened to me. I am literally sick and tired, but we'll persevere nonetheless. I am very, very impressed with Mira Costa High School. I really have to tell you, I Googled the high school when I heard about this invitation, and I guess it's listed now in U.S. News and World Report as one of the best high schools in the country. It's number 300, I think. It's number 5 in California. I actually believe it now, though, because I have to tell you, I don't think that at Harvard or Yale right now, a speaker would be invited to defend the Second Amendment and to defend gun ownership. But Mira Costa High School clearly appreciates intellectual diversity and different opinions. So I think that is really cool. Before we get started on our topic tonight, I do have one very important question that I'd like to poll the audience on. Is it Laurel or Yanny? It's absolutely ridiculous. That's going to be the most contentious point of the whole day. It's obviously Laurel. Well, all right. Maybe we'll get more to that in the Q&A, I suppose. Now we can get on. Now that we've gotten past the contentious topics like Laurel or Yanny, we can get onto a much less debatable topic, which is guns. Now, I did notice that this lecture is happening today immediately following a lockdown drill, which seems a little coincidental. I don't know. I'm not calling it a setup or anything, but a more difficult task, perhaps, to defend the Second Amendment and the private right of gun ownership. When we see all of these headlines in the news, awful shootings, lockdown drills, there seems to be a great fear around the country, politicians and activists talking about it. But I think that we can still do an okay job of that. Guns have been in the news a lot recently. Obviously, there was that terrible shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in February, and this has brought up a new round of calls for gun control from the mainstream media, from at least half of the politicians in the country, from a lot of activists. They're saying, never again, no more, we have to ban guns now. And we'll analyze a few of these points today. Of course, we know whenever something bad happens, we say no more, never again. But we know we live in a fallen world. It's an imperfect place. Bad things will continue to happen. Suffering will continue to happen. We want to be able to reduce those bad things that happen and try to mitigate them. But the question is, would gun control actually stop awful incidents like that? Would they do anything to prevent those terrible tragedies that we see on television? I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. We can analyze all of the evidence that there is. And very frequently, the shock of events like that causes people to say, we have to do something. We have to do something. But we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing and we're doing something that will actually solve a problem rather than just take away people's rights. Right now, in Chicago, there is an art installation. It just went in as part of this gun control movement, which is, it's like those city bike bikes, those bicycle racks that you see in certain cities, except it's mock AR-15s. They're plugged into each of them. And the message of this art exhibit is clear. The message is that in the United States of America, it is easier to get your hands on a gun than on a bicycle. And the trouble with that art installation is it isn't true. As somebody who has purchased both guns and bicycles in my life, I can tell you definitively it is much harder to get your hands on a gun. But actually, I'll go further than that, and this is the heart of today's discussion, because in the United States of America, actually, it should be much easier to get your hands on a gun than on a bicycle. This sounds crazy, this sounds radical, but the reason for this is clear. There is no constitutionally protected civil right to ride a bicycle. There is, however, a constitutionally protected civil right to keep and bear firearms. Now, we know that this is an individual right. We hear it in the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights. The framers and the founders thought that this was so important that it would be number two. It would be second most important only to free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Right after that is the right to guns. Why did they think that? These framers were not stupid men. We're talking about Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. These are pretty smart fellows, and they all thought that this right was so important. So why did they include it? Well, to begin, they didn't just invent the right out of whole cloth. The Second Amendment doesn't read, the people shall have a right to keep and bear arms. In fact, it says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is an important difference, because what the framers of the Constitution are saying is that there is already a right to have guns. Americans have a right to have guns, and we are not going to infringe on it as a government. The United States inherits this right from the English Bill of Rights from 1689. But this comes out of a tradition and a political tradition in the West and in America. Now, the Second Amendment reads, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. This is also important phrasing, because it doesn't mean the right of the government or the right of the states. Some people, especially gun control supporters, they want to pretend that the Second Amendment only protects the right of individual states to have certain firearms and to regulate them, or of the United States as a whole, of the nation state, to keep and bear arms. But the framers are very precise in their wording, and I'm very sensitive to this. I was very precise in the wording of my book. You have to use words very, very carefully. And the framers used the words very, very carefully. They said the right of the people, because in the Constitution, different rights are reserved for the states, for the federal government, and for the people. We have a system of checks and balances, which we'll get into a little bit more later. But the Second Amendment easily could have read, the right of the states to have guns shall not be infringed, or the right of the federal government. But this one is reserved to the people. And this makes perfect sense, because in order for the Second Amendment to protect anything at all, it has to protect individuals' rights to own guns. A lot of times you see in the news, or activists or politicians, they harp on that first part of the Second Amendment, the well-regulated militia clause. And they say, well, all it does is protect the right of a militia to have guns, or your right to have a militia. And this argument fails. It fails for a very simple grammatical reason. Listen, you're at one of the best high schools in the country. You seem like smart people. You can tell the difference in grammar structures between a clause that is operative and a clause that provides justification. Those are the two clauses. The well-regulated militia first part justifies the Second Amendment. It explains why the Second Amendment exists. But the only part of that amendment that actually defines a right is that second part, the operative clause. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That is what operates. The justification gives a little explanation for that. So it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's one explanation. Another explanation could be they're really loud and they scare away bad guys. Guns being really loud and scaring away bad guys, the right of the people shall not be infringed. But frankly, that first part could read anything at all. It could say Pop-Tarts being delicious and nutritious, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, that second part remains true regardless of what the justification clause says. And the wording seems a little weird to us because we don't write like that anymore. We don't write our laws like that anymore. But at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, this was a common practice. It was in state constitutions all over the place. A right would be explained a little bit for future generations like us, but that wouldn't entirely limit the scope of that right. The right remains as it is defined. But even if we grant this part, even if we talk about that militia part, the gun control argument still fails for a few reasons. One of them is the definition of a militia. So unlike standing armies, if you enlist in the United States military, they will issue you a gun. Militias are a little different than that, in that frequently in militias you bring your own gun. It's BYOG sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes militias can be BYOG. So in order for the militia to be able to constitute itself, people need to have a gun. There are a few other definitions of militia. How do we know what the framers thought a militia meant at the time of the amendment? Well, we know from the laws of that time. There was the Militia Act of 1792. The Militia Act of 1792 defined the militia not as some radical group of people, not as a state-run entity. The militia was defined as all white men between the ages of 18 and 45. And I will point out, life expectancy at this time was 36, so that includes a lot of people. That includes approximately 9 years after most people died. That's a lot of people. Now, of course, in the United States, in the intervening couple centuries, we have expanded American political rights to include many more groups of people. They've transcended racial lines and sex lines. And so today, the militia wouldn't only mean white men between certain ages. For one, we live a lot longer, too. But we get an idea of what the framers meant by militia. So now we know what the Second Amendment protects. It protects the individual right of the people to keep and bear arms. Now the question is, why does it matter? And this is the question you hear all the time. If you're ever debating gun rights with somebody, you see it on the news. You know those news shows where it's just two talking heads screaming at one another? Occasionally you can hear someone make this out. They say, why do you need an AR-15 to hunt deer? Why do you need an AR-15 to hunt? And the answer is actually you probably shouldn't hunt deer with an AR-15 because it isn't powerful enough. You should use a more powerful gun. But we'll get back to the AR-15 later. On the point of the Second Amendment does not exist to hunt deer. The framers didn't just really hate deer or something. They're sitting around, they say, okay, Madison, we've got to protect free speech, and we got to kill all those deer. I hate them. I hate those deer. That is the Second Amendment of the Constitution. That's not what it's for. That's not what it's for at all. The Second Amendment, very simply, is to protect liberty against tyranny. That's what it's for. The Second Amendment is not for hunting. It's not for target practice. It's not to shoot tin cans in your backyard. It's not even to protect yourself against muggings and burglary. Guns can be used for all of those purposes. They can be very useful for all of those purposes. But primarily, the reason that the framers enshrined the Second Amendment is as a hedge against tyranny. The framers of the Constitution believed that an armed citizenry would be able to protect liberty in the country. And without an armed citizenry, it would be very difficult to protect liberty, because, well, we've seen this happen a lot. When various governments have taken away the right of people to have guns, they can become more oppressive. They can become more tyrannical. If a citizenry has guns, they can protect not only themselves and their property and their family, they can help protect their cities, they can help protect their states, they can help protect their whole country against threats both foreign and domestic. We saw this shortly after the founding of America. We beat the British. We sent them crying back home. And then they came back just a couple decades later and invaded again. But an armed citizenry can protect against threats, foreign and domestic. And we know that the framers thought this because they said this repeatedly. George Washington said, "A free people ought not only to be armed, but disciplined." Washington also said, "The Constitution should never be construed to prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms." Jefferson said this when he was drafting the Virginia Constitution. Jefferson said, no free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms. If only he could see our debates of gun control today, he would be horrified and rolling over in his grave. But the framers were very clear on what they thought. At the most extreme end of this means that the Second Amendment exists in case the United States citizens have to take up arms against a foreign invader or even against their own government. That's a radical statement, but the framers were fairly radical people in certain ways. It's to protect, even at that point, to take up arms against your own government if push comes to shove, if we absolutely must, as a last resort. Now, it's funny because when you're having the gun control debate with somebody, this is the point at which their argument flips. So the argument first begins, they say, why do you need an AR-15 to hunt deer? It's so powerful. Nobody needs a gun that powerful. And then when you explain to them the reason for the Second Amendment, they say that the AR-15 is not powerful enough. They say, there's no way those guns are powerful enough. There's no way that you could fight off your own government. You're crazy. You say, wait, 2 seconds ago you were just saying that the guns are too powerful. Say, yeah, but that was then. This is now. The guns aren't powerful enough. Say, okay, all right, let's indulge in this. Because they bring up the zombie apocalypse scenario. This is the zombie apocalypse. The United States government, which we all enjoy, has turned tyrannical. You know, they're going to come around and they're going to go house to house and take all of our stuff and start oppressing us. Now, we should point out this isn't totally unbelievable. It might be unlikely for now, but we've seen this happen in Western democracies very frequently, even over the last 100 years. In just the last 100 years, Western liberal democracies have turned tyrannical multiple times. In the 20th century, it happened in Germany, it happened in Italy, it happened in France, it happened in Spain. That is not a good track record for unarmed citizens in Western democracies. So to say it could never happen here is just ignoring the historical record. Certainly it could happen here. We hope that it doesn't happen here. Now, the other part of this argument is that there's no way the American citizens, armed with their formerly powerful, now not very powerful guns, there's no way that they could fight off the government. And I would like to just point out a couple geographic and historical examples here. To begin, the United States is absolutely gigantic. So it's a gigantic country. So first, if the zombie apocalypse happened, there's a fair chance that certain Americans would defect from their newly tyrannical government and would help out the people, servicemen, police, that sort of thing. Even so, just consider the case of the war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is roughly the size of Texas. It's roughly the size of one U.S. state. We have been at war in Afghanistan. We have brought the full might of the United States military, as well as our coalition of allies, to fight in Afghanistan. And we have not successfully been able to maintain order in that area for 16 years. Afghanistan is just a few months away from being the longest war in the history of the United States. And we have not been able to successfully occupy a country the size of Texas. So if the zombie apocalypse happened and the United States turned tyrannical, I think we'd be okay. Because that country is 1/50th the size of the United States as a matter of the states. The country is much, much larger than that. Now, of course, it probably won't get to this point. It's unlikely. I would agree with that. I think the framers would agree with that. But it's not unlikely because things could never get this bad. The reason that it's unlikely is because we have an armed citizenry. The very fact of an armed citizenry is a good indication that politics is not going to devolve and get truly horrific. Because whenever those would-be tyrants, those would-be authoritarians say, I think I'm going to start oppressing people today, they look around and they say, oh, there are 300 million guns in this country, more guns than people, maybe I better hold off. That's a good indication. Those are just the facts of the Second Amendment. Those are just the observable facts, why it was written, what it means, what it protects. Now, some people still want to get rid of gun rights. That's a fair point. They're perfectly entitled to that opinion. They can admit the Second Amendment is there. It protects the individual right to keep and bear arms. The reason it's there is to protect liberty from tyranny. I don't care. I don't want any part of that. Get rid of the Second Amendment. Gut it, amend it, repeal it. I want gun control. Okay, that's fine. Fortunately, our framers were so thoughtful. They had such foresight that they realized that people might want to amend their Constitution over time. So they included an amendment process to the Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution makes very clear how people can get rid of their rights if they want to get rid of their rights, or they can add new rights if they want to add new rights. What this doesn't mean is that people can just start passing gun control laws. Those laws can be quite unconstitutional. They can't just go around and pass a law and say, we're going to confiscate everybody's guns, or we're going to confiscate this gun or that gun. That would be unconstitutional. But they are perfectly entitled to go around and convince their fellow citizens that they want to get rid of their gun rights, and they can repeal that amendment. That is perfectly fine. Except I wouldn't do that. I would recommend, if somebody wanted to repeal the Second Amendment, probably not a good idea. I think the benefits of gun ownership in the United States, public gun ownership, far outweigh the costs of gun ownership. Even big guns, even scary guns, even guns like the much maligned and dreaded AR-15. I told you we would get back to the AR-15. We're back at the AR-15. The AR-15 is all over the news. It is constantly pushed on the news. It's pushed as the worst weapon in the entire world by gun control advocates. They say we just have to get rid of the AR-15. You hear this at rallies. People are talking about this all the time. I think the reason they do this is because the AR-15 is scary looking. And what they say is the AR-15 is an assault rifle. We don't need assault rifles. The AR-15 is an assault rifle. The trouble with this is that the AR-15 is not an assault rifle. I think they are able to convince people that it's an assault rifle because it has AR, and people think that stands for assault rifle. It doesn't stand for assault rifle. AR stands for Armalite rifle. That's the name of the company that manufactured the AR-15. So it doesn't mean an assault rifle. When people are talking about an assault rifle, they're talking about a gun that's fully automatic. You pull the trigger once, and a spray of bullets comes out, like a machine gun. And I think maybe it would be a good idea to limit the exposure to those kind of guns. Good thing is, we did ban those guns 84 years ago. Machine guns have broadly been banned for public use for 84 years. Good thing. Gun control advocates can be very happy about that. But the AR-15 is not an assault rifle. It's not a machine gun. You don't just pull the trigger once and a spray of bullets comes out. The AR-15 is in many ways just like a regular hunting rifle. You have the gun, you pull the trigger once, one bullet comes out. You can take a hunting rifle, same thing. The mainstream media and gun control activists, they focus on the AR-15 because it's scary, also because it has been used in very public incidents, very widely reported shooting incidents in recent times. And I think finally because the AR-15 is so popular. It's one of the most popular guns in America. And so gun control advocates say if we can ban the AR-15, we'll take a huge dent out of the gun market in America. But the AR-15 is actually used in relatively few shootings each year. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you want to reduce the prevalence of guns in the country or the prevalence of crimes involving guns, it doesn't really make sense to ban the AR-15. In fact, according to FBI data from 2011, the number of people who were killed that year and each year from rifles of any kind, not just the AR-15, but the AR-15, hunting rifles, different caliber rifles, all of those people are 323. A relatively small number of people killed each year. To put that in context, 5 times as many people are killed each year using knives. So are we going to have knife control? Are we going to start instituting assault knife bans? No more knives? The federal government's going to storm into your kitchen, take your butter knives, because statistically that's much, much more dangerous than an AR-15. We know that 1.5 times as many people are killed each year with baseball bats and hammers. How about baseball bat control? Should we go in there? The time is now. We need to ban baseball bats. There's not even a constitutional right to keep and bear baseball bats. You could get rid of those in 2 seconds. It would be very easy. To put this in context, more than twice as many people are killed each year by hands and fists and feet as are killed by rifles of any kind, including the AR-15. And I have long said, this is a lethal weapon. This should be registered with the federal government. I'm not exactly a hulking Adonis of a man. Maybe this one wouldn't be. But fists are very dangerous. Fists are very, very dangerous. Should we have fist control in this country? I don't know, maybe. That's something worth considering. Knives, hammers, bats, fists, those all kill more people each year than the dreaded AR-15. The really strange part with gun control activists focusing on a rifle such as the AR-15 is that far and away, many more people are killed each year by handguns than with AR-15s. Over 19 times as many people are killed each year with handguns as with AR-15s. Why is this? Why are they focusing? Why does it seem that the gun control argument always distracts? It always focuses on something that isn't quite true or is misleading from the actual heart of these issues. It's because the AR-15 looks scary, and it looks terrifying. When you explain these facts to gun control activists, you usually get the same response. But we have to do something. And this argument is actually pretty compelling. They say, what do you want to do? You want to do nothing? You just want to sit there and do nothing. You want more people to die. You want students to die. You want all of the, you want to do nothing, but I want to do something, so I'm good and you're bad. That's basically how the argument goes. Nobody wants to do nothing, but we don't want to do something if doing something is doing nothing other than taking away our rights. We don't want to do something that won't solve the problem. We don't want to do something that not only won't solve the problem, but will actually take away people's constitutional civil rights and make other crimes perhaps worse. There is an interesting fact of gun control. They say we need one more law, we need just this law, just this new law, this new law. We have something on the order of 20,000 gun control laws on the books already. It's not that we don't have any gun control in the United States. We have something on the order of 20,000. It's actually hard to count how many we have because we have a federal system. So different cities, different states, the federal government has these different laws. But there's very good news here. Despite the media coverage, mass and school shootings are way, way down in recent years. More children are killed by swimming pools and bicycles than by mass shootings. Over the past 25 years, 10 students per year are killed by guns in schools. That's out of a country that has 56 million students nationwide. Children killed in school shootings are down 75% since the 1990s. There is no epidemic going on. Actually, all of the statistics, all of the news is moving in the right direction. That's a very good thing. There is no evidence that the enactment or repeal of gun control laws has had any effect on that during that time. This doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. We could allow teachers to exercise their constitutional rights. We could arm schools. We could have new mental health policies, which would probably be the most effective. One thing we shouldn't do is infringe on the Second Amendment. As a matter of public safety, there is no evidence that the gun control saves lives. On the contrary, there's actually some evidence that other crimes increase. We know that this country has more guns than people. Even the countries that have instituted mass gun confiscation have failed where tried. In Australia, there is no evidence that mass confiscation, first of all, it didn't work because only a fifth to a third of the people actually gave away their guns, so most everybody kept their guns anyway. There's no evidence that this had any effect on homicide or on suicide. Same thing in South Korea and Japan. We also know that 2/3 of all gun deaths each year are suicides, mostly committed by middle-aged men, and we know that gun confiscation policies has not been shown to have any effect on reducing the suicide rate. As a matter of constitutional law, the framers are clear. As a matter of history, we see what happens when countries take away the right to keep and bear arms. And this brings us to our favorite contradiction. I'll leave it here, and then we can take some questions. You'll very frequently hear people say, especially today, they'll say this White House, I won't mention the occupant, I won't mention but they'll say they really don't like him. And they'll say, this guy, he's an authoritarian, he's an oppressive person, he's just waiting to oppress the entire country, and that's why we should give them all of our guns. But you just said they're awful people, they want to kill us and enslave us, but that's why we should give them all of our guns. Even before this most recent presidential election, you would hear people say, on the issue of police brutality, they would say, the police are bigots, they're unfairly targeting certain demographics, this is awful, they're racist, they're oppressive, they're brutalizing people, that's why we should give them all of our guns. That's why the police should be the only people to have any guns. This doesn't make a lot of sense. The framers knew better. They knew that centralized government cannot be counted on to protect liberty. They knew that an unarmed citizenry would be ripe for oppression. And so they instituted checks and balances. We have checks and balances between the three branches of government in our country. We have checks in the federal government. We have checks and balances between the federal government and the state government. And ultimately, we have a check and a balance between the people of this country and all of their governments. That's a really good thing. It served us very well for the entire history of this country, and I hope it continues to serve us well in the future. I know we're running late on time, so let's open it up to questions.
All right, here's our first question. We might go into the passing period, but if you want to stay, you're more than welcome to, so long as the administration doesn't get mad at me. And our first question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Emily. So I really liked a lot of the stuff you were saying, actually, because as a Democrat, I do have a lot of opinions and ideas on gun legislation in general, and I know that the media and mass news does often plays it to the extreme. But one thing that I'm just a little confused about is you were saying that the Second Amendment, to put limitations on it would require an amendment process. But I know that there are limitations on the First Amendment that we have that don't go through that same amendment process. Furthermore, I know that people like me on the left don't necessarily want to completely eradicate the Second Amendment, but the types of legislation and restrictions that we want to place on it would keep guns out of the hands of certain people. And from what I've been hearing of you saying, there haven't been many concrete solutions on taking away guns from the hands of people that should not be having these guns. And from the areas that I've been researching and looking into, these people are able to gain access to these guns rather easily. So I'm not sure how else you want to combat that without proper legislation laws.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I will point out to your question that none of the major gun control laws that have been proposed in recent years in response to recent shootings would have prevented any of those shootings. Even PolitiFact, which is a left-leaning website, has admitted that that is true. So the question always is, what solution does one propose? You're absolutely right. These rights are not utterly absolute. There are some reasonable limitations on freedom of speech at various times, and there are some reasonable limitations on the Second Amendment as well. But I think many people in the Democratic Party in particular are trying to place unreasonable restrictions on the Second Amendment. We saw this in the recent presidential campaign. The Democratic nominee campaigned and said that the decision in D.C. versus Heller, the decision which upheld the individual right to keep and bear arms, that was terrible. We've got to get rid of that. So if one is talking about a reasonable restriction on guns, say that we're going to limit the access to a machine gun or to the Tommy gun, that's perfectly fine. But if one wants to put the restriction on the Second Amendment that we want to take away the individual right to that gun, which is what Hillary Clinton said, that seems to me not just a restriction on the amendment, but to gut the amendment entirely. In years past, because you're very reasonable, in years past there were many more reasonable people on this issue on both sides of the aisle. This was not a terribly partisan issue. In recent years, as the Democratic Party has moved further to the left, you're seeing more outward calls for the utter repeal of the Second Amendment, the gutting of the individual right to keep and bear arms. That is not reasonable. That goes to the heart of it, and there is a constitutional way to do that, but I think that party would have difficulty convincing their countrymen to do it and to pass that amendment, which is why they try to skirt the issue with laws and with judicial rulings.
That's my follow-up.
In the interest of time, we can't have follow-ups. I'm sorry, it's running late. So
you can
Tom,
tweet me, and then I'll answer follow up that way.
If you have questions still, then get in line. All right, Tommy.
Hi, I'm Tommy. So in your words, you say that the Second Amendment protects liberty against tyranny. So if you sort of support like a living interpretation of the Constitution, which I know you don't, then you would
Well,
say,
the Constitution, does it get up on its hind legs and start dancing around? Is it really alive, or is it a dead piece of paper with words on it?
Well, I just mean depending on if you're a constitutional originalist or not, you could interpret it different ways if you're a judge. But So anyway, you're saying there's an implied power against coercion from the government, but then you're also saying that the operative clause is totally concrete. But so I support a theoretical implied power against coercion from the federal government. But in my view, there would be more sensible ways and measures of doing that. So, for instance, you could have limits on police weaponry, like no armored vehicles and stuff like that, caps on prison populations, a whole set of measures to prevent government coercion. You could also, let's say, prevent security for office holders from being too strict, and in that way, you could have this implied freedom from coercion, and you could go about it.
That is a good point, and this gets to the heart of the Second Amendment, because you say a good way of ensuring liberty against tyranny is to ask the federal government very nicely to limit their own powers. I think that's the implication here. The police, they'll just limit the kind of weapons that they have, and the security for our politicians, they'll just kind of limit themselves, and don't worry, trust us, we would never take away your liberty. But that does not have a very good enforcement mechanism, and we've seen historically in countries like Italy, Germany, France, Spain, that when we trust the government to protect our liberties don't get protected. In fact, the entire purpose of the Second Amendment is to make sure that ultimately, as a last resort, we don't need to trust the law enforcement or the political class or our government itself to protect our liberty, because ultimately, as a last resort, we can protect it ourselves.
Hi, I'm Josh, and first of all, can we both agree on that, like, that AR-15 is for sure, like, deadlier than most pistols and Glocks?
On the contrary, pistols and Glocks kill many, many multiples more people per year. They kill over 19 times as many people per year as rifles of any kind, including the AR-15.
But you could say the same thing with, like, nukes, right? Nukes don't kill anyone.
Nukes do not kill anybody per year.
But they're capable.
0 people per year are killed by nuclear weapons.
Exactly. But they're way deadlier is what I'm trying to say. That if a nuke were to go off or someone were to use them more and they're more readily available, that nukes would for sure kill more people.
I actually don't accept that premise. Handguns are much deadlier. It's a reason why there's a higher age limit to purchase handguns than to purchase rifles. Rifles are unwieldy. They are kind of big. You can't conceal them easily. With handguns, you can easily conceal them. It's why they're used in so much gang crime. It's why they kill so many more people per year. They're much easier to have, to hide, to shoot from, to get rid of. I don't really accept that premise. The AR-15 looks much scarier, but in reality, it is significantly less lethal than other types of weapons on the market.
But to like my main question, I was going to ask, so your equation basically is saying that the more armed the people are, the more, like, the less susceptible and better, like, they are to resisting government tyranny. Why can't we just give the people nukes or whatever machine weapons they want and enter in, like, a lifetime of government-free, tyrant-free government? What's the moral line in the sand and drawing to what we can give the people?
That is a good question, but I think you've stated a little differently the point that I'm making. I'm saying that a reasonably armed citizenry is a hedge against tyranny. I'm not saying that there is a direct variation between how armed a citizenry is and how much their liberty can be protected. So if we gave nuclear weapons to everybody, if we made everybody into like a little rocket man over there in North Korea, that we would have a much safer country. I don't think that's the case. This is why there can be reasonable restrictions on certain rights. But to say that everybody has the right to common arms, as the Second Amendment is regularly interpreted to mean, is a hedge against tyranny. To say that also you can't have nuclear weapons, I don't think that significantly imperils the United States. Because, of course, in the doomsday scenario, in the zombie apocalypse, the question is, would the government drop a nuclear weapon and oppress its people? I think that's unlikely. I think we've seen in the history of wars in the United States and in the history of insurrections in other countries and totalitarian governments, that's not quite what happens. We have to be reasonable here and not take things to utter extremes, because politics exists in reality.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us today, first of all. The thing that has to be addressed, though, that was not mentioned, is that the Republican answer to these shootings, that while they may be small, should not be happening regardless, has been things like measures arming teachers with baseball bats or arming students with river rocks. We had a Pennsylvania governor say those kids can sure throw river rocks pretty damn fast. How is this seen as a reasonable measure to stop these mass shootings? And the alternative to that is not convincing based on your argument.
Well, I think you might be understating the Republican solution to this, because if we're talking about solutions, there actually has been a solution over the past 25 or so years. We know that over the past 25 or so years, mass shootings and school shootings have declined precipitously. They've declined 75%. So whatever we're doing seems to be working. What were some of the policies that led to that? Well, more robust policing helped that, and law and order reform, criminal justice reform, locking up more criminals. There was a famous headline in the New York Times. It said, "Crime rate decreases despite prison population filling." So despite, maybe those two have something to do with one another. So that's one answer. And of course, the Republicans have proposed allowing teachers who have concealed carry permits to carry weapons. This doesn't seem like such a bad idea. When a would-be killer sees a sign that says gun-free zone, they see a ripe target. If you don't know who has a gun, you're much less likely to be reckless in violence. The Republicans have proposed arming guards at schools. Doesn't seem like a bad idea. And of course, mental health reform. This is key. In the United States, it is virtually impossible to involuntarily commit somebody. That has been the case for decades now, and so you have mentally unstable people on the street and able to access certain weapons, obviously in a country with 300 million guns. There has been no serious proposal from Democrats to reform that mental health system. It's very hard to say we want to be able to lock someone up against their will. I think that's why there hasn't been a lot of political will for that to be done. But to say there's no solution is misleading. The last 25 years have been a wonderful slate of solutions, and it's a very good thing that mass shootings have decreased by so much in that time.
So first off, I would like to thank you for being here. But one of the first things that you discussed was that if we look at the evidence of the effectiveness of gun control, that gun control is just not effective at all. And I was just wondering, since the bill passed in 1996, budget bill, that contained the amendment, the Dickey Amendment, which basically restricted the CDC's ability to study gun control, stating that the studies conducted cannot support gun control. So I was wondering if you support the amendment or not, and why.
Absolutely. I don't think that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, should be investigating our constitutional rights. I don't think our constitutionally protected civil rights are a disease. Quite the opposite. I think they're a very good thing. This gets to a facet of the left that is, I think, central to the leftist premise, which is they want to study everything as a scientific question, as a material question. But of course, our rights are not scientific or material. Our rights are philosophical. We have natural rights from the natural law. And so I don't think we should study that as a disease. Now, there is a very good thing, which is, as I mentioned previously, mass gun shootings have decreased precipitously in the last 25 years. During that time, we've enacted certain massive gun control legislation, the assault weapons ban, even though there aren't really any such thing as assault weapons, but they use the term, assault weapons ban of 1994. A decade later, that law was repealed. That had utterly negligible effects on gun violence in that period. So while certain people would like a bureaucratic entity to go in and study it as a disease and say, this is what science says, ban all your guns and get rid of your constitutional rights, it isn't that easy. And actually, all of the historical and philosophical evidence seems to support the Second Amendment and the individual right to keep and bear arms.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm keeping you late from class.
Thank you to the Young Democrats once again.
Thank you so much.
Very good questions. Very good questions. Do you need more? If you need me to elaborate on anything, just ask me. Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Really brilliant.